is going to be fun today. This will be an intellectual journey for us. Ready to roll? We usually have a trumpet fanfare for you. Yeah, we will. We'll get you the fight song.
They know you won't leave without your purse. I call to order this meeting of the University of Minnesota Board of Regents. It is a work session for the purpose of hearing a report on the economic impact of the university. That should be a very interesting and thrilling discussion, but before we start on that, I want to take this opportunity to welcome and recognize our three newest regents. This is their first formal meeting, other than the swearing in yesterday. In no particular order, but looking from my left, Dave McMillan, Laura Broad, and Steve Sviggum. We welcome you, and we also welcome back to the board after his re-election, David Larson. So I think they all deserve a round of applause. It's good to have you here. We, I think on any board, there ought to be an open invitation, particularly to new people, to look at how we do things and offer suggestions. Those of us who've been here a while often get in the habit and get used to things, and new folks see things that ought to be asked about. And so we welcome your comments and your questions about that. So be sure and let us know what ideas you have. Thank you for being the candidates, and thank you for being a returning candidate, David. It's good to have you all with us. With that, Mr. President, you probably have some introductory remarks.
I do. Chair Allen, members of the board, when we planned this work session, I didn't anticipate we would have Tom Stinson here, our state economist, and so you're going to have a morning filled with economic statistics, economic trends, and so I thought we ought to start with the really good news, the economic return of the University of Minnesota, and then we will have a pretty interesting session later in the morning on the economic trends in our own state. Incidentally, I'm really open to your suggestions too about anything I can do in my performance, and I'd like you to really reference those suggestions for after July 1st. Anyway, I'll let that sit there. Let me start my very quick introduction. Nearly 150 years ago, and this anniversary is coming up rather soon in 2012, the Morrill Land Grant Act was passed to strengthen this nation's public universities and also to strengthen the role of our public universities in fostering the nation's economic development. 150 years after the passage of the Morrill Act, the role of research universities in the nation's economy is still a pressing concern. It's still vitally important to our nation's future. I think economists, and I think you'll maybe hear this later from Mr. Stinson, will tell you that there are two primary factors in the global economy that will make a difference in Minnesota's future. That is, will make a difference in our economic development and our economic competitiveness. And they are clearly the education, the skill levels of our people. It's estimated that 70% of the jobs in Minnesota's economy by 2018 will require some post-secondary education, and increasingly they will require a 4-year baccalaureate degree and beyond. And the second thing that's really important, and you've heard from Vice President Mulcahy on these issues, is that we need to build in this state a culture that really incents and supports innovation, research, discovery, and the application of ideas that have economic value but also have the potential to solve significant issues here and beyond. Last summer, we decided to launch a comprehensive study to assess the university's overall statewide economic impact, and I asked Vice President Mulcahy to lead this effort. The effort was conducted by a highly respected national firm, Tripp Umbach. It has a very strong record of conducting such studies in healthcare and higher education and many other sectors of our economy. And Tim Mulcahy and our study team from Trip Ombach were really assisted by some very able people. I can't mention all the names here this morning, but Peter Radcliffe, who is the director of our Office of Institutional Research, John Merritt, who is one of the chief deputies in the Vice President for Research Office. Lisa Carlson Warren is here this morning, also in the Office of the Vice President for Research. Patty Franklin and Jim Thorpe in my office were very actively involved as well. And you can't do a project of this size and complexity on this kind of fast-track schedule without having some extraordinary people on the ground here. And I want to publicly thank them for their hard work and making sure that we have something to talk about here this morning. Last Monday, we released some preliminary findings. You probably saw the short articles that were in the paper. Our approach today is to take a much more detailed look at the data. In fact, coming out of the brief release of the information last week, we actually added questions, and we've added deeper analyses that you'll hear about this morning. Since we're talking about money this morning, before I introduce the guests, I want to talk about money. I want to anticipate a question that you might have or members of the audience might have, and that is, what does a study like this cost and who pays for it? Trip Ombach's fees and expenses for the study come to under $50,000, actually $48,000, and it's well within the range that other institutions like ours have paid for studies of this kind. The source of the funding to pay for the study was from an annual endowment that the University of Minnesota Foundation provides to the President's office, so we did not use state funding, did not use tuition dollars, did not use public taxpayer dollars. We used private support that we've raised ourselves. An added benefit of this contract that I'm really very excited about is that the university will emerge with the methodology and the database that we have put together here over these many months so that we will have the tools ourselves to conduct deeper analyses on our own, and that will of course be added to the annual reporting that we do, our annual accountability reports, and to the university's overall metric strategy that we think is as good as any in the country. So without further ado, I want to introduce our primary speakers. First of all, I want to introduce Paul Umbach, who will carry most of the, at least an initial presentation today. He's the co-founder and CEO of Trip Ombach. And Nicole Parker, who is a principal researcher with Trip Ombach. Nicole has the good sense to live in the Twin Cities, where the weather is actually better than it is in Pittsburgh, as I understand it today. And she has been really instrumental in leading this effort on the ground and getting us to the point where we can have a really rich conversation about it today. So I think it's time to take it away and take us, Paul, through the presentation. And then we'll have plenty of time. We should have plenty of time for questions and comments.
Great.
Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Bob and Chair Allen and the members of the Board of Regents, I have a lot of very good news for you and a lot of details. What I want to make sure we do at this workshop is have me move quickly when I can through so much information, but also leave time for your questions and comments. If along the way you have a burning question that you want to ask, it's okay to ask it, because I want to make sure that you folks all have a chance to understand the information. I want to just say that over the years, we've had an opportunity to do more than 150 studies like this, coast to coast, since the late 1980s. And this is truly one of the most comprehensive and one of the most impressive economic impact stories that we've been able to tell. We've worked at the university in the past several times. We did a feasibility study for the Kaufman Union back in the mid to early 1990s. We did a study for the Mayo Clinic similar to this study in the year 2000. But truly, the story that we have today really is among the one or two most far-reaching stories that we've been able to tell. And I want to also thank all of the folks from the university that have worked so closely with us to add more and more to this presentation. Just 2 weeks ago, the presentation was about half as many slides, so I have to remind myself to keep moving. The objectives are pretty straightforward. The first objective, and for a university like yours, it's no small objective, and that is to quantify the economic impact of the University of Minnesota on the state of Minnesota, but to take into account all of the aspects of the university. So in that, you have regional campus impacts, you have the Twin Cities impacts, you have impacts related to outreach, extension, your research institutes, and when you add it all up, there's quite a lot of pieces that have to be measured, including your athletics and also the whole health and hospital impact, which is quite significant in its own right. You folks as regents are really governing quite a large multi-billion-dollar and very complex institution. The second objective was to really look at the regional impact. And what we found, and I'll show in much more detail later, is over $600 million of your impact is actually outside of the counties in the Twin Cities region. And that's like having an entire other university operating statewide. And we'll get into more details on that. And then the final objective is really why we're here today and why we were here 2 weeks ago, and that is to articulate the benefits of a major research institution. There's a huge communication challenge that we all have to have people understand what it is to have a university like this in your state, and what it is to really have something that can benefit the economy, benefit citizens at the level that this does. And to articulate that is something that's a really major goal of this study. The impact analysis that we did was based on Implan. And Implan is actually a Minnesota-based company that has a model, input-output model, that's been used around the world and around the country. And we've used it hundreds of times. And what it does is it allows us to really see in great detail how the University of Minnesota, in all of its ways, is impacting the economy, not just directly from your spending, but also indirectly. And I can just give you an analogy of how this would work within Implan. We're in Pittsburgh, and you folks, and I want to thank Bob for once again sharing with everybody the fact that you are and have been paying us. I appreciate that. But when that check comes to Pittsburgh, it's not counted in your economic impact on the state of Minnesota. However, when I come to Minnesota to make a presentation, all of the spending that I have is counted in your impact. And although I'm just one person coming to the university today, hundreds of people every day from around the world come to Minnesota because of the presence of the university. And they're spending money, hotels, restaurants, cabs, airline landing fees. They're also paying taxes everywhere they can. Nicole represents dollars that we've paid her that stay actually in the state. So another way Implan works is for vendors like Trip Umbach, our spending that Nicole spends is counted as part of your impact as well. And all of that is circled throughout the economy to have a very conservative measure. Now, one thing I will also tell you is that this is the most conservative methodology that you can use. For those of you who know about impact studies, sometimes people take $1 and they add a big multiplier to it. And they say, well, every dollar is like 5 or 6 or 7. Here, our multipliers are very conservative, and you'll see later when we go through the data. And the reason being is that this is a very quantifiable, defensible way of explaining to people how many dollars you actually generate and actually mean to the Minnesota economy. I'm going to take you through some numbers. I always think that after that much preamble, if I don't get to numbers, people are going to wonder if we have numbers. Well, we have tons of numbers, I want you to know. And the numbers are great. Your economic impact in a year, in the year we studied, fiscal year 2009, was $8.6 billion. And that's per year. That's just in that year. And that's about 1 out of every $26 in the state's economy. So if you're walking around with $26 in your wallet, I'm kind of old school. I still carry cash. My younger friends don't. And my kids don't, I know that. And one of those $26 in your wallet is in there because of the University of Minnesota and what it generates for the state's economy. And I think if you look at this slide, you'll realize that directly you have a $4.1 billion impact, but then that $4.5 billion is all of the other respending in the economy due to the presence of the university. The pull-out chart shows that about a third of it is related to your health science enterprise. About one in every $6 is related to your research enterprise, and we're going to talk more about those later. And then the rest is the operations of the university. One note I want to make is that you have a university that has so many moving pieces that we actually have the ability with the database that we've created to break all of this down by program, by campus, by really all of the different things can be broken down. And building that database for the university gives them a nice planning tool to say, okay, where is our $8.6 billion impact, and how are we, almost like a stock portfolio, where are we leveraged and where do we have our operations helping the economy? You might think that's a big number, $8.6 billion. It's actually in the top 2 or 3 of all of the universities we've ever studied. And all universities are a little different. Some have entire health systems that are part of the university, like at the University of Iowa, so they're heavily weighted toward healthcare. Some, like the University of Washington, have a $1 billion research enterprise, and they're heavily that way. One thing that's interesting about your study is that your 8.6 is very comprehensive, and the impacts are in many, many areas, not just here in the Twin Cities, but as you'll see later, regionally. And what I want to share with you is that there's a whole bunch of things not included in the $8.6 billion annual impact. And I'm going to let you look at the slide here. The operations is really the 8.6, and in that is capital, research, salaries and benefits, visitor spending, like I discussed when I visit, and student spending. But there's probably 2 or 3 times more economic impact that's not counted in that, and that is in the research commercialization. Implan might actually be an example, because I'm sure it was researchers here at the University of Minnesota that came up with the software that actually ran this. And we're not including Implan's economic impact in this. We're not including the in-state alumni impact. And later I'm going to show you some data that I think is astoundingly exciting to show you what just one class over their lifetime of earnings means. But that's not included. So all the alumni, all the product of the university isn't involved. Also the attraction power. People come to Minnesota to start businesses, to make investments, to participate in joint ventures. They come to do business in the state, and without a strong research infrastructure, that would be diluted. And we're not quantifying how much attraction power there is to people that want to come to this community just because the University of Minnesota is so strong in so many areas, or communities throughout the state as well. Knowledge and expertise, all of the consulting you all do, all of the value that you provide. I know that just your business school and some of your other schools alone, in terms of the value of the interns and the faculty that do projects, we're a consulting firm. I could put a number probably on how much the value of the consulting that the faculty and students and graduate students do, and that's not including the $8.6 billion. And finally, arts and culture, libraries, all of the different things that you're able to provide on campus to the community are also not included. And that's not a complete list. If we brainstorm long enough, we could probably make another slide of other things that aren't included. But what is interesting when we get to this slide is that you're a major employer. And not only are you a major employer, you're a major generator of jobs in the state of Minnesota. What we have in front of you is the fact that almost 80,000 jobs are supported by the University of Minnesota and your Fairview partnership. And as you can see from the breakdown, I won't read all the numbers, it's about 42,000 direct jobs as broken down. And that includes fellows and students, and only the Fairview jobs that are related to the university. Fairview has a health system that has lots of hospital jobs that aren't included in this. Actually, Fairview by itself would be the 7th largest employer in the state. And some universities have chosen to add their health system partner, and they get these really big numbers because they've added every hospital job in a whole system. And some universities have gone even further and have counted the economic impact of all their living alumni in the state. And it gets to be a little bit too much, maybe, for the legislature and other audiences to digest. The thing I want to focus on right now is that 37,000 indirect jobs. Well, sitting next to me is actually a portion of one of those indirect jobs. Because we pay Nicole, and this has been a major project for her, a part of her pay is actually, and a part of her job is actually related to the University of Minnesota. And so let's now think about that. Food service, security, contracts with parking, contracts with all the other vendors, professional service firms, the folks that do your accounting, your banking. If you took away those 42,000 jobs, those 37,000 jobs would also go away. One of the big misperceptions, and I'm going to educate you a little bit on this because you might get questions as regents. A lot of people think that everybody kind of shares these indirect jobs and that they really wouldn't go away if the University of Minnesota wasn't here. Somebody else would get some of those indirect jobs. No, this is really true. The way M-Plan works, all of those 37,000 jobs are attached to those 42,000, and you'd actually lose the whole 80,000 jobs. So it's very important that we articulate the fact that not only does the university employ people and these other breakouts you can see, the other jobs are very, very tied to those. So about 1 out of every 43 people that have a job in the state have their job because of the University of Minnesota. I want to take you now into a whole other realm of the study, and this is a very important realm for regents, but also important for the administration to articulate. The state of Minnesota has supported this institution for almost 150 years and has made contributions, and those contributions have really, in a sense, been the foundation or the base for building this enterprise, which is now a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. And doing a return on investment analysis seems really simple. It's 2 calculations. How much money do you get from the state, and how much money do you return to the economy? Well, you might think it's simple. It's not, because every university in America counts this differently. Some universities say, we're just going to take our basic line educational amount we get from the state. But in this study, we were extra careful to make sure that we counted every dollar. And not only that, we counted it in the year that you actually were getting a lot more money from the state, 2009. So what we have is $650 million that we're counting as the one number against your $8.6 billion, which is the other number, to come up with a $13.20 return to the economy. $10 back to the state's economy for every dollar is kind of a typical measure. You're above that. But one thing I want you to know is that this is the most conservative approach when we're communicating with the state, because a lot of the money in that 650 we would count as pass-through. For example, tobacco funds, the state manages it, but it's out of a federal settlement. So the state, we're crediting for giving to the tobacco funds. I mean, there could have been another model, and some states have other models, where tobacco funds can go directly in grant programs to a university. And there's all kinds of other grants and contracts. Sometimes the state contracts for certain things. We're counting that as a contribution, even though you're providing some services in return. I can get into more detail and questions and answers on this, because I know this will be a topic that you're going to all be asked about with the legislature. But I do want you to know that even as conservative as we've gone, we were able to show a very strong return on investment to the economy. And that's every year. Every year, that many dollars goes back. Let's get into the tax side of this. There is a misperception in some states, and I think your state would be one of them, that the University of Minnesota really isn't a generator of taxes. That the University of Minnesota, because it's a public institution, doesn't generate payments to state and local taxes. And that's actually couldn't be further from the truth. Our study estimates that $500 million a year is generated in taxes for state and local government in Minnesota. And about 136 million is generated directly. Let me tell you a little bit about that. Nicole pays income tax. She's a vendor. I paid a hotel room tax last night, and every tax you can imagine since landing, probably a landing tax at the airport, rental car taxes, and on and on. I can tell you the whole model. It's a lot. And that is because the University of Minnesota. All of these employees pay local taxes and state income tax and other taxes. So the misperception that you don't pay taxes is not true. I think the word I would use is generate. You generate $500 million, and it's quite a lot of money for the state's economy. One thing I'll let you know is that out of your $8.6 billion, just about $2 billion of it relates to your tourism draw. The fact that people come and they spend money, they visit, they come from all over the world, and all of those dollars are taxed every way they can be when people come to visit. So I think that that's a message I want to make sure that we focus on. This is a breakout slide. This is on research. Why did we do this? Well, because it's such an impressive story. Let me go back to the base that the university builds. The university has a base that the state has supported, and the dollars in that base from the state create the enterprise, the platform. But what we find is that you're able, with that strong platform, with the faculty and the scientists that you've been able to hire, often with state funds, to be able to go and fish for and bring in competitive research grants, now totaling upwards of between $700 and $800 million a year, largely from the federal government. And here's another misperception, that there's an entitlement program for universities. Some people will tell me, well, the University of Minnesota probably gets their fair share of that NIH money or NSF money, because I'm sure there's an even way to divide that. It's not true at all. Actually, your faculty and your scientists have to compete for that, and it's competitive. So in a sense, you've created a pool of people that are able to go out and bring in fresh dollars to Minnesota. And later we can talk more about what happens if you would weaken that base, lose those faculty, lose those scientists, and then they can't bring in the 700 to 800 million in fresh dollars. Well, this research enterprise alone here is a $1.5 billion part of the whole pie and supports over 16,000 jobs. So it's almost like an entire other university, a standard state university in the United States, has an impact similar to what your research enterprise is. And that's been a growing part of the university's impact over the years. And it's very balanced, too. I want you to know that in certain places that we've worked, it's largely health science. UAB would be one that would come to mind right away. We just did a study last year there. Here, you have lots of good research numbers throughout the university in ag and resources, in liberal arts, your coordinate campuses and the other research around the state. It's about $20 million of research that comes from the other campuses in the state. And you're really going to find, as you look at this, is that it's a growing portfolio of research that's comprehensive. So you're not leveraged toward one kind or another. Okay, I'm taking a break here because that's all on the state. There's much more to present. What we've done so far is taken you through a tour of what the university as a whole means to the state of Minnesota as a whole, and we've touched on just some of the high points. I can't tell you enough how many breakouts there are and how much opportunity there is for you to break this out more, trying to stay at a high level. Now we go to a regional level. There are 13 regions that the State Economic Development Office has done. And this is not atypical. Most states divide their state into economic development regions. We felt that when presenting this to state audiences, it would be good to kind of use the same framework for presenting your economic impact, since these are defined regions. And as you know, there are campuses in Crookston, Morris, Duluth, Rochester, and of course here in the Twin Cities, and they're noted throughout this part of the presentation. one thing I wanted you to know, that in this presentation today, we're just going to take you through the regions where you have a major campus, because we actually have the data broken down in this slide deck for all 13 regions. And as interesting as I'd like to believe I am as a presenter, I'm not sure I can hold your attention for 13 regions. I'm going to take you through the regions that will matter the most to you. Let's start, first of all, in the Northwest region, where you have the campus in Crookston. But you have more than just the campus in Crookston. You also have regional extension offices. You have some outreach and different kinds of AHAC and health science programs. The economic impact in the Crookston region, or in Northwest region, is about $34 million a year. And you're going to look at this chart and you're going to say, why is the induced and the indirect so much smaller when the direct is 25 and there's only 9? Well, it shows you how in-plan works. There's only so many dollars that can be respent again that don't leak out of that region. And you also have neighboring states that have larger population centers across the border where a lot of dollars leak out. I want to tell you that that's still a significant impact, and it's a very strong story, because when you start looking at the employment, 531 jobs being supported in that very underpopulated part of the state turns out to be, in ratio, quite a lot of jobs per capita, and important amount of employment in that area. I'm going to take you now to the region that has a Duluth campus. Now, the Duluth campus, as you can see, and the Duluth market is a stronger market in terms of its indirect and induced impacts. You can see right away that the indirect and induced respending of your campus and your other operations, and there you have different labs, research centers, extension offices, your Natural Resource Research Institute, and you can read all the different things that you have. Quite a lot of installation. I think outside of the Twin Cities, this is the second most a developed part of your program. You're looking here in 1 in every $35 in the regional economy is related to the University of Minnesota and all of its aspects. And one little footnote, we're counting all the impact of the university in that region. So if the University Twin Cities campus spends money in Duluth, that's counted in there too. I'm anticipating a question. So this is all in for that region. And you can start to see that there's quite a lot of employment impact. 4,000 jobs in that part of the state is an important part of the thing. It's about 1 in every 25 jobs in that region are related to the University of Minnesota. We're going to go to the region where you have the Morris campus. Here you have about 1 in every 50 jobs in that region of the state related to your operations, and about almost 1,000 jobs in that area. And you can see the economic impact there. I'm going to move a little quicker now that we've kind of oriented ourselves to the slides. You have a new campus in Rochester, and a partnership that's grown out of that with the Mayo Clinic. There is a great opportunity in this region, and as you can see, about 900 jobs are directly or indirectly related to the university there, and about 61 million. The opportunity that you have here has largely been driven by the Hormel Institute, and even though the campus is still relatively small, there's other things that you have in Olmsted County that are adding to your impact. Now, not to leave out the rest of the state, we actually have, for regions that are from other parts of the state, an impact in every state. Every county and every region has measurable impact from the University of Minnesota. Oh, we didn't even get to, I was acting like we were done, but we're not done at all, because here's the campus that we're sitting at today. Twin Cities campus. It's a $8 billion part of the pie. Remember I said before, out of 8.6, 600 million were out of the Twin Cities? Well, this is what's in the Twin Cities, and about 70,000 of the jobs. So about 10,000 of the jobs roughly are outside, and about 70,000 are in this multi-county region. And you can see, and I'm not going to read all of them, there's quite a lot of the university's elements that are here. I think what's interesting about this is that when you really start to look at the impact, it's 1 in every 29 jobs in these counties. If you went down to just the core counties in the metropolitan area, if you broke that down even further, it would be more like 1 in every 20 jobs in the core metropolitan area. So what we're really looking at is the university being the biggest employment generator in the Twin Cities, and I think everybody understands that, but I don't think we communicate it probably as often as we should. Now for the rest of the story. Nicole knows that I use that a lot. Paul Harvey was one of my favorite people. I'm dating myself a little bit. I tell my young friends and my kids about listening to somebody on the radio who would then come back after a commercial message with, "And now for the rest of the story." And I always enjoyed that. Now for the rest of the story. There is a lot of other stories. And I want to just say, this is an incomplete list of rest of the stories. And I want to thank my friends from the university that have challenged us as the nation's leader in this kind of analysis to push us as far as we've been pushed, because they're so curious about other stories. Well, what about this and what about that? Well, one of the things that we've been just starting to focus on is the education of the future workforce. Keep in mind, all of these stories now are above the $8.6 billion. The 14,000 students who graduate every year are essential to the state's human capital and workforce needs. 90% of all the STEM doctoral degrees, 85% of all medical degrees, 100% of all the pharmacy professional degrees like veterinary and dentistry. And you're a talent magnet attracting students from a wide range of disciplines, many who then stay in the state. So we're beginning to quantify what that all means. And you'll see in this presentation that alumni do play an important role. About 10,000 companies in Minnesota have been formed over the years by your alumni. And about 25% of these people came to the state. I remember when I was applying for a PhD in geography years ago, almost 30 years ago, one of my schools of choice was the University of Minnesota. And one of the things that would have been interesting, I sometimes imagine myself in one of these three places, one of the two other places, and think about all the people that come here for graduate and professional schools who then stay, start businesses, and employ people. That's a very important aspect of a research university that's not well communicated. And I think that the 500,000 people that work for those companies and the $100 billion in revenue is definitely beyond your operational impact. Let me tell you another story that we've just been working on. The 14,000 people that graduate, we have been able to quantify how much more money they're going to make, both as undergraduates and and professional graduates, over their lifetime. So just for this one class, just for the graduating class of 2010, we estimate that they're going to generate in their life for the economy $8.9 billion. And then the next year's class in 2011, they're also, during their whole life, is going to generate that. And the classes that have actually happened before have been doing that, but you all haven't been measuring that. The average college graduate of your programs and the undergraduate make about $8,000 more per year than the average from all of the other state schools. And for graduate and professionals, it's even more than that. And some of that's because in many of the areas, you're the only place providing the graduate and professional degree, so it's significantly more than that. So what we're looking at here is an ongoing annuity. I would look at this as the ongoing annuity where I would look at your operational impact more as money in the bank for that 1 year. This is really what's going to pay off over time. And then you have the strong partnerships you have in the community, the free care that you offer, the money that you donate, about $204 million we estimate are in your community benefit. We're probably decidedly conservative on this. We're only counting certain measures. We're not counting every measure. According to the Points of Light Foundation standards in terms of what a value of donation is and volunteer time, $127 million in student, faculty, and staff contributions. Those are based on national standards. I'm sensing Minnesotans are more generous with donations. I'm sensing Minnesotans are more generous with volunteering in their time. I think this is a state that's particularly strong in community engagement and involvement. So if this is a national standard, I don't know, I'd add 30% or 25% to this to get closer to what I believe your true impact is. Well, we're almost done, and then we're going to get into questions, but I want to just go through a couple of the high points. And there are many high points in this study. $8.6 billion a year in impact just by operating as a university in the state. And that's not even really counting what you're supposed to be doing, and that is educating the future workforce, bringing in talent, creating all the opportunities that providing an education provides. And it's throughout the state, as I said. So there's 80,000 jobs from that. 13 to 1 return on investment from what the state gives you. $500 million in tax generation. $1.5 billion research enterprise with 16,000 jobs. And the fact that these graduating classes go off and help the economy year after year throughout their life. And then the charitable contributions and other things. So one thing I want to conclude with is to let you know that research universities, because they're not understood, have had a tough time in the last couple years. And maybe this is the intro to your questions and answers. Tough time because maybe they haven't communicated, or maybe people don't want to hear the communication. But they're the single best investment that a state can make. And if you take a look over the last 150 years, this is the best investment you could ever make. And when you start to look at the future, it's going to be the best investment, because Minnesota is going to be getting into a situation, it used to be just the neighboring states that had brain drains, and just the neighboring states that couldn't attract talent and keep talent. But as that becomes more of a Minnesota issue in the future, you're going to need strong research universities like yours to be really the magnet that holds people here and brings people here and brings the dollars here in the future. So that's my final conclusion, is that the future impact as it becomes $10 billion a year is going to be probably more important to the state when you become 100,000 jobs than maybe it even has been in the past. I'm going to invite Nicole to help with questions and answers. She'll get the real hard questions where there's very details, and I'll try to help as well. So
Thank
Bob
you.
and Chairman Allen, I appreciate your attention.
Thank you very, very much for an exciting presentation. Mr. President, did you have any follow-up comments before we go to questions?
No, I think you should go directly to the question.
Regent Beeson, and Regent Larson, Regent Simmons, and Regent Frobenius.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. It was an excellent presentation. In your business, there's a theory of substitution effect, and you hear about it in stadiums where discretionary dollars can get respent. They'll get spent anyway, whether or not there's a professional team here. As I thought about your presentation, the areas where that effect is invalid is areas of research, areas of excellence, areas of talent recruitment, where, but for the work we're doing now, that talent, that money would have to go out of state.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, probably for a big part. Probably half of your impact would be completely it couldn't be done by anybody else. And because it's not in a situation where it exists somewhere else, and I like your analogy because we've done a lot of the other impacts of the fact that dollars would be spent somewhere else. I think you've said it very well, and I think for the rest of the group, you need to understand that it's not like there's all these other places for people to go. You are the place, and if not, they'd have to leave the state, and you'd see a real brain drain if you didn't have this asset here.
As a follow-up question?
Follow-up, you might be more explicit about that in your report if you can quantify that, because I think that's people have seen these studies before, and there's some spending that would occur anyway, but
Right.
the way you described it, I think, is important.
Great. I think a breakout on that would be really great, and I appreciate that, Regent.
Thank you. I have Regents Larson, Simmons, Frobenius, Cohen, and Sviggum on the list so far. Regent Larson.
Thank you also for an outstanding report. What I'm interested in is, okay, you've done an excellent job of capturing the real value creation that's going on as a result of this enterprise. But if it's not effectively communicated, as you pointed out many times, then you don't get a lot of credit and you don't get as much support in the people's self-interest, if you will, because it is in their self-interest to support because of the return that you get.
Yeah.
So what I'm interested in is, are you aware of an institution in this country, a university, who has done a study like this, who has most effectively communicated it over time? Mm-hmm. And if so, I would like to know who that is so that we could see if we couldn't collaborate with them and learn from their experiences.
Right. It's a very good question, and thank you for that question. I think there's 4 or 5 places that have done certain things very well. Probably no place that's done all of things well. And what I will do as a follow-up is do and Nicole has done a start on this of looking at best practices for communications, and we're going to continue on that. If you look at the work that the University of Iowa has done and the University of Washington, they were able to use social media, be able to use their web environment more effectively than others. It's not just in a paper format and it only matters. So that they would be strong on that. Others have done a very good job. I know that we had just done a project for University of Alabama, Birmingham, and they were very effective in getting partners from their business community to go to their state capital and advocate. The folks also in Spokane, Washington, sent 300 people, this is a best practice, to advocate for the report on their economic impact in the Olympia capital without having just someone like Bob leading the charge. So back at UAB, we were able to put together this round table of business leaders who told Dr. Garrison, the president, you don't have to be in Montgomery all by yourself fighting for this. We're going to be there shoulder to shoulder as the top employers and business leaders. So maybe what we'll do, and what I'm going to say, is that it's not maybe one school. I know Penn State has done a nice job too in certain aspects. We'll make a collection of the best practices, and we'll give that to the university as a roadmap.
Yeah, it needs to be a comprehensive, in my impression is that's not just one action, and it's certainly not just the most senior officials at the university. It needs to be a very comprehensive approach.
Yes. With
a whole bunch of different partners that can tell the story very effectively. Mm-hmm. And when you get that job done, it seems to me that it's likely to be much more effective.
Yeah. One thing I will add, Regent Larson, is that you have 42,000 communicators. And I'd like to challenge this university, and I've challenged other clients, to not make it just the regents or the president or the senior administration's job or the professional communicators, of which you have great leadership here, but to find ways at barbecues and in church basements and at picnics in the summer for people that are employed to be able to just say, do you know that 1 out of every 25 jobs is the job that I have, or ways to do that. And I think that kind of creative, kind of grassroots is going to be a very important thing, and not just here, but statewide as well. So,
Regent Simmons.
Thank you. May I first comment on Regent Larson's question? Another organization that has effectively leveraged this type of data is Mayo Clinic in getting state funding from Minnesota for the University of Minnesota Mayo Partnership and Research. Highly effective, engaged the business community, and developed broad support throughout the state. So that's another example. My question is this: are you able to look at this data and analyze it in a way to see what the state's investment in the university translates into for economic impact on the short and long term, and conversely, reduction in state investment in the university, how that affects short and long-term economic impact.
Yes, very good question. My first comment would be that we did have a chance to work with both the university and the Mayo Clinic on the economic impact for the Minnesota Biomedical Partnership. And that is a good case study of how before that, they didn't understand what the return would be. When you look at this model, it does work both ways. We have in the model spirals going upward or spirals going downward. And I've used this analogy before because people don't understand that if you cut the base support, those dollars and the spending isn't there then to be spent, and it does affect job losses. But that's just the beginning of the story. What does a job loss mean? Well, it's an opportunity loss. And one of the things that we're wanting to do in the next phase of this is to take a much more careful look at how those decisions are made. For example, if a faculty member is getting the impression because the state cuts that their opportunity isn't what it was before the state cuts, they're probably more likely to maybe be poached away by another state. This has happened in Boston for the last 20 or 30 years. No one ever was able to go and move the buildings of Harvard to Texas or Louisiana or other states, but they sure were pretty effective at taking the faculty, the scientists, and the major generators of income. So we will continue down the path in the next phase to really quantify how that really works, because that erosion at first doesn't look like much. But as President Brunix had said, I think very effectively in our first meeting, there is a tipping point. There's an economic tipping point where there becomes a sense that this is no longer a well-supported environment, and that attracts people away, but it also cuts down your power to invest in new faculty to bring in. And once you're in a situation where you're past that point, you're not in a strong position to grow the enterprise anymore. And that's what we have to avoid. What we're fighting, though, is states saying, you've become a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and you've done it while we've been giving you less and less, so why don't we give you nothing, and you become even a bigger multi-billion-dollar enterprise. So we have to avoid that by having the careful analysis that you speak of to say, well, let me show you how that works. And I think one of the ways to do it really effectively is to say, we would be a $12 billion impactor if you would have kept the support that you had. We're now limping along. I mean, we're still up and operating, but we're not operating near as well as we could, and here's the data that backs it up.
Thank you. Quick follow-up?
Yes, please. To me, it becomes critically important to do that next analysis, because I don't think the message is strong enough. I think it's still taken for granted. I think it becomes far more powerful if we can look at the option. More funding would have resulted in this. Less funding will result in that. Where does the state want to be? And it's a message that has to go beyond the government. It has to go to the public, because our leaders are elected for terms, and the public is here for the duration.
Good point. Regent Frobenius, followed by Regents Cohen, Sviggum, and Broad.
Thank you. I've endorsed all the way along us doing this study. I think it's absolutely critical, and I appreciate the comments, particularly about the communications. Regent Simmons went down a road that I would like to go down a little bit further. First, I think of what you have told us. The rest of the story is really the outcomes of the University of Minnesota. The economic impact is an analysis of the process that we go through to achieve those outcomes, and that's what's generating the dollars that you really analyze in this process. It helps me to think about it that way. The question that, the cynical question that pops in my head, and I don't really feel I have a good answer for, is this. In the years I've been on this board, the state support of the university's budget has dropped from 35% to 17, 18%. It's cut in half. It has been replaced by tuition and, to some degree, internal efficiencies that we have picked up in operation. What is the impact of substituting tuition for state support on this type of an economic impact study? My sense is that we can't make a really good case that that's not within a range of still having a demand for students, What difference does it make where it comes from?
Well, I think that what you're really going to look at, I have children that are college age. And I woke up 3 days ago, and my wife said to me when we listened to the 6 a.m. news on the radio, that Penn State was going to be cutting its state support, get their state support cut by $200 million, half of it. And the first thing my wife said is, you know, maybe that Allegheny College scholarship is a much better deal now because it's going to cost a lot more to send Christian, our youngest, to Penn State, even though he's on a scholarship with the Schreier's Honors College. And I said, yeah, that's right. It's also going to kind of put a dent into our financial planning to pay more. One of the things that happens in a state-supported system is that you're forcing things to happen in the economy that aren't natural, like sending children out of state, which isn't good for the economy, long-term or short-term, especially long-term because their chance of coming back is really low. So the first thing I would mention is maybe we'll send our child to McAllister instead of to Penn State because it's going to be about the same cost now. So that's one thing. And I could take you through several other things. And I'm speaking just as a parent, what you're dealing with. You could also get into a situation where the economic hardship it puts people through, which is very, very much an issue, would prohibit the gateway that this university has always had to public higher education. And then that gateway continues with professional and graduate studies, and you could actually become a university that doesn't provide the access statewide because of the cost. Now, what's the cost of not having access to education? Well, it's not like in response to the state raising your tuition, the others, to go back to the theory that Regent Beeson put together, it's not like the other private colleges are going to lower their tuition to create more access, provide more opportunity, to make sure more Minnesotans stay in the state. No, it's going to create less of a flow of talent into the universities and more of a flow out of the state. And you go too far with this, and you start to erode really one of the great benefits of state support, which is the broad opportunity to raise the quality of education and economics and income of people. And that's a devastating path to go down. If you want us to study this more, we can definitely put finer points on that.
Regent Cohen.
Well, you've sort of made a transition into the question that I wanted to ask. Thank you, Chair Ellen, and thank you for presenters for a really significant report. Having just met with some alumni officers and the executive director, and knowing that we have about 400,000, I believe, alumni over the world, many of whom are still in the state of Minnesota, not all, I'd like a little more clarification and elaboration of the slide on page 11, the top one, because I think that could be one method of communicating this message. If our alumni really recognized how important this is, I think they could stand up and say, yes, I'm one of the 25 jobs, or this is the increase in average earnings per year that I have. So if you could just elaborate a little more on that slide. And I think you mentioned that average earnings in comparison, I wasn't sure to what or whom or whatever, so okay. I'd appreciate that.
Yes, thank you. And I want to just say thanks for that question. It's a very good question. This presents another opportunity, I think, for further analysis and study. It's a whole world of understanding what your product's impact is. And I'll give you some of the detail. When you graduate, folks, as undergraduates or graduates, we're able, through a survey of alumni, to track how much money they get in their jobs. And we don't assume that they're going to work for 40 years. We actually take a third of that away for either disability, for being out of the workforce, for unemployment. And then we take the average salary of other graduates that have the same degree for the state. You, like other Big Ten schools, not that we use athletic conferences to compare, but let's face it, that's a measure. have about a $6,000 to $9,000 increase in the wages that the graduates have in their career in today's dollars on an annual basis. And for professionals, as I mentioned, it was quite a lot more because in some of the cases, you're the only place producing those other professionals. That adds up to this amount of money. Now, I want to just say that in most of the presentation, we've had this thing called direct, indirect, induced. I want to just caution you. That $8.9 billion is all direct. That's how much more dollars are being spent by these folks in the state. We're not counting how much more groceries are bought and how much more different cars and things are bought to support other consumer industries. We're not counting all the respending of all that extra over the course of their life, $8.9 billion. And as a result, we don't even get a full measure of what that extra income would be. The counterpoint might be, well, if we didn't produce these graduates that made more money, I'm sure we could attract people that make more money from other states. So why do we have to have this enterprise that keeps people here in Minnesota making more money? We'll just, when we need someone for a higher paying job, we'll just recruit them and they'll come from Pennsylvania or from Illinois, bring them in from Chicago or other places. And that's where the whole thing falls apart. And the reason it falls apart is all of those regions are trying their best to keep those people too. And the people in Pittsburgh, where we have somewhere about 160,000 college students in our city, we're trying as hard as we can to keep the best from Carnegie Mellon and from other schools like University of Pittsburgh in our city. So it's not like it's an easy job just to say, well, we won't need to invest in making this product. We'll just buy this product from other states. And we can definitely do more detailed analysis.
Thank you.
Regents Fingham. Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Buck. I will echo and second the importance of this study, the significance of it. It's very, very important. Thank you for doing it. And I've been with you the whole way, except for we all hear different things,
Yes.
at different times. In your response to Regent Fabinius, when you started talking about your choice as a parent, I almost heard you saying the state can make a better choice for resources than parents and students. I almost heard you say that. Maybe I was hearing something but we won't go there. That's what I was hearing.
I didn't mean that. Right.
And that's when I started going a different direction.
Sure.
But to follow up on the question that Regent Simmons asked, which was what direction I wanted to go down, can we go to decision makers, just citizens of the state even, more importantly, because they're the higher body, the citizens are the higher body, and can we take your study and can we extrapolate it? Can we, you've backed into the $13, by dividing the state support $620 million into the $8.6 billion economic impact, so you backed into the $13.20 for each dollar. Can we go to the state and say, you give us another $100 million, we can guarantee you another $1.3 billion of economic activity? Can we extrapolate that and in the reverse?
I think not only can we, I think that's the next generation. That's the next frontier for universities to be able to actually put together models like these models and a plan related to the model for taking state investment and creating a return on that investment. I believe from our research we've done that the dollars prove out. If you take even analysis that's been done on federal dollars from NIH, all the federal studies, this isn't our studies, these are the federal people that study things, have shown that every dollar of NIH has had a $7 return in the states that they've paid over the years of the federal government studying that. I think that if you had a situation where a plan would be in place to leverage state funds for economic development, that would be the next generation of a study like this. And that's the kind of creative approach that I think states are going to have, because to just say support us because we're your old land-grant university really need to be now faced with support us because here's what the return we can provide and how we'll make that return.
Measurable standards.
Measurable standards.
Goal. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes left. I have 3 people on the list, Regents Broad, Ramirez, and Allen, and the President wanted to toss in a comment too at this
Yes.
point. Mr. President.
I'd just like to, Chair Allen and Regent Spigum, I'd like to make a follow-up comment. I think it's deceptive to say if we increased, let's just say, the state's investment by 20%, so let's say we put another $120 million into the University of Minnesota and state support, I don't think it naturally follows that we will get the same multiplier effect. And I think the advantage of this model is we can model different alternative investments for that $120 million because they will not all yield the same rate of return. They simply won't. So that allows you to begin to think about where is science going in our society, where is the economy going in our society, where are we strong, where do we have comparative advantages, and it's this kind of analysis helps inform the setting of priorities. And in some cases, that helps set the priorities to reduce expenditures in some areas that are not just producing the right rate of return. And the other thing I would quickly add, this is not just about money. I think in some cases we want to make sure that we do the hard-headed analysis on the qualitative side to talk about, well, what do the arts and humanities add to our community, and why is that really important to an educated citizenry? So I think we need to be careful we don't just get sort of pulled into this sort of straight dollar for dollar kind of analysis. But it does allow you to do more nuanced planning, including making different judgments about your enrollment management strategy. So if you look at the student profile in the last several years here at the University of Minnesota, it's increasing. Our growth rates have been in areas of STEM-related disciplines where the economy and where society is moving to create more and more demand. So to me, all of your questions are in one way or another touching on, well, so we've got the information, so what? What does it mean? How do we leverage the information to make better judgments, set better priorities, reset our course, when that makes sense. And to me, this is going to be more of a journey. It's not going to be a one-time presentation. We're going to have to come back to this kind of analysis over and over again.
Regent Broad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And a quick comment. As I look at these economic impact studies, I think they're really important tools. And they help provide a trajectory, which I think is also important information. But one thing I'm not sure they get to is the sense of value, because I do think that costs and benefits and economic return on investment are different than value from a variety of different angles. And sometimes when you squeeze efficiencies out of something, you reduce the direct, but you increase the indirect impact. And so there's some dynamics there, I think, that are very important as we try to, make something smaller but better, if you will. Right. But one of the 2 questions I had was, first of all, related to the earnings on page 11. How are those numbers tempered by student debt? Is the first question. And then my second question is, I'm interested in the sectors. What does the agricultural economy and economic impact mean to the state of Minnesota? Sure. What does the biomedical economic impact mean to the state of Minnesota? Because I think in terms of messaging and communication, having the ability and the strategic direction with those specific groups could be very advantageous in communicating the message.
Right. Well, let me answer both questions. The first question on debt, we didn't account for the fact that there's more debt, which would temper some of that spending. The second thing related to the sectors of the economy, that's where this database works so well for us. Through IMPLAN, we're able to show how much the impact of the university is in each sector, each of the ones you mentioned, and probably 400 other ones.
And also, we can do analysis on the primary sectors within the economy to see how you stack up against those. So we're fully capable of doing that. So to pick out some major drivers of the Minnesota economy and look at how this compares.
And even in percentages, what percentage of that major part of the economy is the university? And what part of the economy that's growing? And that can go back to maybe what we were talking about before One thing that Bob mentioned I thought that was really, really well stated is if you know where the investment's going to really pay off, to be able to then go strategically to the state and say, we've matched up the sectors that are growing, where we're strong and where we think we have the best opportunity. Now you can start to really make a difference. So I think those, and as far as the debt, one thing what we found is that the debt load that I've analyzed is not significantly different between publics, privates, and different kinds of state-supported institutions, to the point where I think that might be kind of adjusted within the model. But I really think that long-term, what we have to do is to say, where is the economy going? Where is the university going? Where do they match? And I think that's a brilliant way to look at it. And we have the data to be able to do that.
Thank you. Regents Ramirez, Larson, and Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions. One is just kind of a clarifying question for me. There's a statement here of 79,497 jobs for Minnesota citizens throughout the state. I think this is more for President Brunix, but I think that's maybe a little imprecise. I was under the impression we had some international faculty and stuff, and are we using citizen to just mean people who are here in Minnesota? Because I think one of the things the university does is bring in diverse people and people from other places and people who are not citizens in the U.S. immigration sense of that, and I just don't want to lose that component of our workforce. Is that correct understanding?
Yeah, this is all the folks that have jobs, whether they're American citizens or not. My apologies for maybe not being clear on that. The other thing you got to keep in mind is that this whole study is based just on what your impact is on the state of Minnesota. You actually have a bigger national impact, and you have folks that live outside the state. You also have people that live and work all over the world. So I think that your worldwide impact is much larger than 8.6. Your national impact might be 9 or 10 billion. And so just to be clear, these are all the people that have a job in the state of Minnesota, regardless of their citizen.
Thank you. And one other
Quick follow-up.
short question. I was wondering if you would just comment on the integrity of the data that you're working with here. I know there's value in bringing in an outside company, so it's not the university going forth to say, look how much money we're generating for the state, we should be getting more money from the state, but you're still working with data provided to you from the institution. So in your experience in working with other places and other organizations, can you comment on the accuracy of the information you got and your confidence in it?
Yeah.
Well, I think the data that we received, I've finished 5 of these studies in the past year. The quality and the availability of the county by county breakouts was much better than I've received in the past. The level of assumptions that I've had to make on in and out of area spending is much less than I've had to make in the past. So the integrity and the quality of the data is by far the best that I've worked with.
Thank you. Regent Larson.
Yes, I'd like to go back to Regent Frobenius's question, where basically he said state funding has been cut in half during the time that he's been on the board, which is about 8 years now, John? And it's been replaced primarily by tuition and also by more private donations, but primarily by tuition. So I don't understand, and grants. Whether, regardless of where the funding comes from, as long as you get it, why would it make any difference? Or am I missing something? And it seems to me that it probably wouldn't. The trouble is, will you get it, number one? And number two, will it have unintended consequences? And let me give you an example. If a student has the prospect of graduating with $30,000 in debt because tuition had to go up so much, how many teachers are you going to produce? How many social workers are you going to produce, et cetera? And is there unintended consequences for the society? Isn't that the real question?
It's a very good question. I think in further analysis, we can model different scenarios run it through some of those unintentional consequences. We have the same thing right now in medicine. Why do we have only 9% of the folks going into primary care specialties? Well, it's because they come out with $300,000 in debt, or 180, I think is the average.
They can't pay for it as a GP, right?
So they go and do a fellowship, and they do subspecialty rotations and residencies, and then they want to be plastic surgeons or whatever else and also, we also run into a situation where long-term those professions are critical to keeping not just the economy going, but keeping the university comprehensive and strong as well. Are you going to cancel all the programs that don't have high incomes at the end? And what does that do to the university?
Thank you very much. Regent Johnson.
The first part of the question, directly to the first part of the question, the mix is where the dollars come from. I sensed the last part being answered. I didn't sense the first part being answered.
Well, in economic impact modeling, all dollars that are spent are counted the same. A state dollar doesn't count more in the economy versus a dollar from a donor, doesn't count any more than a dollar in tuition. I think the issue that we have to address, though, is a longer-term view of the sustainability of the university. With the university that you've built a university for 150 years that's based on state support as being the foundation. If you change that foundation, although economic impact models run the same, would the university be a strong long-term? And I believe that the university's base of support provides the confidence and the security for folks that are making decisions about coming to a university with their talent and with their research, bringing sometimes as much as $50 million in research with them. If I'm going to make a decision to go to Stanford, I'm making that, or Cornell, or if I'm going to make the decision to go to Harvard, I know that they have tens of billions of dollars in endowment, which gives me the security that my faculty position is going to be strong. It's a fundamentally different question at a state-supported school to operate like a private school in attracting the talent. So I think it's a security issue for the university, and that's where I think it becomes very dangerous for a state to start to play with that too much and not have the endowments there to give people the confidence to bring their talents to your state.
Thank you. Regent Johnson, and then I think we will need to conclude.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Mr. Ombach, full disclosure, I'm a Lutheran preacher. I tell people every Sunday some things, hopefully they believe it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Your report, for most of us here, we believe it, okay? There may be some questions. The problem, the gap, goes to communication to the people of Minnesota. The great majority of people, unless you live in Crookston, Morris, Rochester, Duluth, they don't necessarily believe this.
Yeah.
There's a perception problem. There's a communication problem. I'm not being critical of you. I may be swimming upstream a bit with my fellow board members, but I'm sitting here listening to the discussion of how you better communicate this good news, if you will, as the rest of the world goes on. Mm-hmm. You know, as the general public sees the university, they tend to see it through the eyes of medicine, Carlson School of Management,
right,
many programs. And I would also say they see it through our athletic program. Right. I was sitting here thinking, I wonder if Alabama and Ohio are cutting their universities. And I say that because they didn't have national championships, they're close to it. Okay? Mm-hmm. And I know you think I'm tainted in my thinking. I understand that. But I will venture to say that Alabama and Ohio have not cut their state appropriations to their major universities. Mm-hmm. I'll let you draw your own conclusion. Right. Do you know why? Because those fans won't let their legislators do it.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah. One last comment. I'm a Missouri Synod Lutheran, so you can imagine how conservative I am. I went to Concordia Lutheran College in Nebraska.
I'll pray for you.
But one But one thing I will tell you, just in conclusion to Chairman Allen, I was very proud, and Nicole too, to do this project in partnership, such a close partnership with the university. And we look so forward to coming and meeting you as the Regents who are really our client for this. And I want you to know that there's a lot of work ahead, but also a lot of exciting opportunities to communicate. And you know what? That's a challenge. You put it out there. How do you get the folks in a region that don't have a campus or a part of the university? And we'll take that on and we'll do it. So
Thank you very much. Paul Umbach and Nicole Parker, thank you very, very much. And Paul, don't worry too much about the praying. I worked for a different Concordia college, and he prays for me all the time.
Okay.
And I saw there was an implicit suggestion there that you were willing to offer your pulpit as a means of our communicating some of this. Is that right, Regent Johnson? If so, we'll take it under consideration. Thank you very, very much. This concludes our work session, and I need advice from the Regents. We probably have time, if you wish, for a 5-minute recess, in which case I will call the meeting to order and then take the recess, or we can go immediately into our business.
5-minute recess, please.
5-minute recess. I will conclude the work session. I'll call to order the regular meeting, and the first item of business will be a 5-minute recess. But we will start in 5 minutes.
If that doesn't confuse you,
That's where I belong.
That's for this.
We will call the meeting back to order. More or less. The first item of business is introductions and recognitions. President Brunix, Vice President Mulcahy, and myself will welcome McKnight Land Grant Professors. Vice President Mulcahy is already at the podium, and the President and I will join him.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here this morning to recognize our McKnight Land Grant Professors for 2011. The goal of this extraordinary program is to advance the careers of our most promising junior faculty at a critical period in their professional lives. I'd just like to take a moment to mention the McKnight designation in this award is particularly important, and the land grant designation. The McKnight Foundation and funds that derive can trace their origins to the land grant award that created the University of Minnesota 160 years ago, contributes to these awards, and the land grant recognition at the time was the recognition of the great potential that a university would have in this region, and this award acknowledges the great potential these faculty have in their career. So I think they should be particularly proud to be carrying the McKnight Land Grant designation. The recipients are honored with the title McKnight Land Grant Professor, a special award that they will hold for 2 years. The award also consists of a research grant in each of the 2 years, summer support, and a research leave in the second year. Now I'm pleased to introduce to you our McKnight Land Grant Professors. When I call your name, I'd ask you to please join me at the podium, and then we'll get some pictures and I'll introduce your colleagues. First, Professor Brian Alkima from entomology.
Let me read the citation first. I will read the citation just once in alphabetical order. You get to be the honored person in the award here. University of Minnesota McKnight Land Grant Professor. The Regents of the University of Minnesota, on the advice of the faculty and the Vice President for Research, hereby appoint Brian Akuma as McKnight Land Grant Professor in recognition of significant potential for academic distinction with all the rights, privileges, and responsibilities attached thereto. Signed this date by Executive Director of the Board of Regents, Ann Cieslak, President Robert Brunix, and Chair of the Board, Clyde Allen. Congratulations to each and every one of you.
Next, it's my privilege to introduce Professor Aditya Ban. Next would be Professor Chad Myers from Computer Science and Engineering. Next, let me introduce Professor Cheng-Yan Wei from Horticulture Science and Applied Economics. And finally, although he is not with us today, believe it or not, he is getting married. So Professor Christopher Hogan from Mechanical Engineering is unable to attend, but we would also like to acknowledge him in this way as well. So for him, let's give him a round of applause. I'm afraid I just can't help but comment how young they look. This kills me.
Item 2, approval of the minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes? Moved Regent Hung, second Regent Cohen. Discussion, additions, corrections? If not, all in favor, aye. Aye. Opposed, carried. Item 3, report of the President. President Brunix.
Chairman, members of the board, ladies and gentlemen, it's certainly been a busy time since we last met in the February meeting of the Board of Regents, and I just decided to highlight a few things that we've all been working on. Obviously, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we produced the progress report on the strategic planning effort that you endorsed and launched back in 2004. And Provost Sullivan produced an additional report on academic investments for this meeting that I hope you'll have a chance to read. It's truly an impressive account of where we've been and the kind of investments we have truly made. Our federal government has started a very serious effort to increase national exports. You undoubtedly know we have, I think, a challenging balance of payments problem, an issue in the United States, and there's a feeling that if we can get small and mid-sized businesses better connected to the world economy, that the United States has a real shot at regaining some of its economic position. So the U.S. government trade representative Ron Kirk was here, along with other very significant leaders, to kick off a national tour. They decided to start here. Starting here in the middle of February, struck me as a real affirmation that this is a vitally important economic center in the country. And I think this is a very successful effort. I really want to thank our faculty, staff, students, members of the board for getting so engaged in the Capitol rally and the legislative testimony. I'm just really proud of the work that our students do. We don't rehearse them, we don't script them, we don't ask them to stand in front of the mirror with our observation. They go and speak from the heart about what they feel about the University of Minnesota and its importance to the state. Vice President Fitzenreiter and I, of course, testified second time, or maybe even a third time, if you think of how many times he's been there, before the House Higher Education Committee, and I think it was a very good session, a very engaged session. The economic impact study you know about and State of the University address was my last swan song address last week, and I want to thank so many members of the board for being there and for many of you for getting back to me after the address. I thought the inauguration on Friday of Chancellor Lindley Black was a very special moment, at least in my memory of the of my time here at the University of Minnesota. I thought it was a wonderful event. I thought he gave a fabulous speech, and I think that campus is on to bigger and better things, and I think he's going to be a very, very strong leader for the long-term future. I'd like to take just a few moments just to stay with our economic theme. No one knows for sure, where a tipping point is. It takes judgment, but I think one of the things I would point out is that part of what was done in the strategic plan and positioning process was to make the argument that the state needed to invest in the University of Minnesota. And it wasn't just about operating capital, it was also related to long-term capital investments to keep the university strong in critically important areas. I think the Biomedical Discovery District is one of those transformative commitments that this state has made. And I just want to go on record. You will hear me hang up the usual crepe. I don't like these budget cuts. I think they're too deep. I think they're putting our state very much at risk when it comes to the University of Minnesota, so you'll hear me say that. But at the same time, I take great pride in the commitment of this state and the commitment this state has made to education at all levels and to the University of Minnesota over its 150-plus year history. And I think our state has done actually better in putting capital investment into the University of Minnesota. And I could actually go down a list along with the provost and Dr. Friedman and many others and point out some very significant superstars who would not be here without that long-term view and that long-term investment. And so I think our conversation has to be more than about tuition and operating costs. We need to think about the whole picture. And that's why we felt so strongly that the economic return study needed to incorporate the full picture. There are many of these economic return studies that ignore capital investment as if it doesn't cost the state any money and it doesn't add particular value. And we decided that we needed to have everything, as Paul said in his presentation, all in, so we could get the kind of arm's length review we need. You've seen this particular chart before, state appropriations trends, and this is O&M is operations and maintenance. That's sort of the core budget that covers the research infrastructure, the educational infrastructure, the operating infrastructure, if you will, of the University of Minnesota. That's about 18% of our all funds budget right now. That particular 18% probably includes about 3 to 4% that is tied up in state special appropriations, or maybe even higher than that. Actually, 20% roughly of our budget is in state specials of one kind or another. You can see in this chart that there's kind of a 10-year rollback, even a little more than a 10-year rollback, very close to an 11-year rollback in our state appropriations. And during this period of time, as many of you have pointed out, we've made up a lot of the difference, some with tuition, a lot with budgetary reductions. Our mantra is to try to take 2/3 of the pain, if we can, by becoming more productive and to set really tough priorities, trim in some cases badly needed investment. But anyway, this is sort of the trend line that we're going to be looking at, and what I'm concerned about is that downward slope. We obviously know we have to be part of the solution, and we're working at that, but I'm hoping that there'll be some balance in how these reductions are given to the University of Minnesota. I tried to be dramatic. I've never been an actor, although my kids think I was an actor when I was trying to sternly reprimand them during their teenage years. But I tried to be dramatic and say, think about this for a moment. If you're talking about a 15 to 20% cut in the university's base state budget, and let's say it was $100 million, and many people think we can grow our way out of this with private support. A $1 million cut would take a $1.2 billion endowment in a short period of time to make up that difference on an annual payout basis. So there aren't simple solutions here, and I'm just really hoping that these reductions that people are talking about will be far more moderate. I've also made the point, and I want to make it again and again and again, this is not a one-time event. This is the second biennium in a row where we're talking about taking $100 million of base budget support away from the university in Minsku. And if it was a one-time thing and the economy was recovering quickly, I would be a much cheerier person and have a much sunnier personality, and you would see that. But when you're talking about back-to-back 4 years and 3 such, serious reductions in less than a 10-year period, that's where you get into a position of some threat, not just here, but around the country. And I don't take any great solace in the notion that they're doing it in Ohio or Iowa. I mean, to me, that's not a very good sort of way to think about the long-term future of our state or our country. So I use some examples. If you took a 15% reduction, and then, of course, I got lots of emails saying, why are you threatening us? And that wasn't the purpose, because we wouldn't do any of these. But I was just trying to give a framework so that people could understand the size, the severity, and the impact of the reductions. So if you close the Duluth medical schools and the medical school here, you'd have less than $90 million, and we're talking about $100 to $130 million of possible reductions. If you closed all the coordinate campuses, and you couldn't recover the money very fast, but you'd have $76 million. Or science and engineering, one of our largest and most important colleges, pharmacy dentistry, would make up about $84 million. Veterinary, the vet school, the vet diagnostic lab and extension would total about 1/3 of what we would need to balance this budget. You'd have to increase tuition 13 to 17% to solve the problem if that was your only tool. Or you'd have to lay off 1,700 workers in a short period of time. So we aren't going to do any one of those things. We'll have to do a lot of them in combination. But I think it gives you a sense that this is not child's play. It's not a simple thing. We're really talking about very, very deep reductions. This next slide is something you've seen before. I thought I would put it up again because at least 3 of you have not heard this presentation before, but we started with a base budget at the beginning of the last biennium of roughly $3 million, and that budget was cut to roughly $591. Some restoration was done on a forecast basis. We discussed in presenting our budget or formulating our budget for legislative presentation. The governor's recommended cut was steep. It was 6%. Higher education sort of led the parade in terms of the severity of cuts, and that would take us down to 6.3 or close to $604 million. Obviously, I would take a budget for next year in a heartbeat at this level. I think we're going to be looking at much more than that, but at least I want to give you the bookends that we're talking about. I think we're going to see recommended levels of reductions, percentage levels that are going to be in the double digits, and I'm just hoping we'll find some solutions to keep them from getting close to the 20% level, because I think that is going to be very difficult for us to pull out in a short period of time. What are we going to do about it? We're going to do a lot of things that we've been working on for a number of years, and I've said this before in previous presentations. We are going to make really big reductions in academic and support units across the university. In the last biennium, the range of those reductions was from 0 to 11%. They were differential. They were targeted. They will be again this time. We've really continued to place a very deep emphasis on reducing administrative overhead, and the plan will be for deeper reductions in administrative overhead than in academic programs. We really try as much as possible to protect student support and investment first, academic support for our program second, and so we'll try to continue along this line of taking more out of administrative overhead, although I think we're getting pretty lean there at the present time. I think you will see more this year than in any previous year, that many of our academic units are moving towards self-support with little or no state funding. And you'll see more of that this year than I think we saw last year and clearly in preceding years. The budget's balancing strategies are going to try to do everything possible to protect the academic quality. The University of Minnesota, you will see a balanced budget. I felt it wasn't prudent and useful or productive to spend a lot of time talking about the pay increase for university employees, so I said very, very early in the discussions last fall that I expected we'd have a pay pay freeze, subject to the normal requirements of collective bargaining. I sent directions to our Benefits Advisory Committee to save anywhere from $12 to $15 million in the base budget for our fringe benefit costs. So we're re-examining and pushing the envelope pretty aggressively to see if we can at least restrain the growth of those benefits, but also be as efficient as possible. We're going to implement a third retirement incentive program that I feel has worked really well. This allows you to, I think, take down your workforce in a more planful, strategic, and targeted way. It also doesn't throw large numbers, hundreds of people out on the street with little or no notice, and that's going to roll out as well. We've reduced new investments, obviously reduced core operating expenses, and I've tried very hard during this period, and I could use any advice you can send my way to communicate on an ongoing basis with the academic community of 19,000 plus people statewide. Vice President Fitzenreiter presented this budget timetable in the Finance Committee, and I'm not going to comment on it, but that sort of gives you the sense of what this flow of dates is. And I want to end with what I think are some very good news trends that really, I think, reinforce the presentation you heard from Paul Umbach just a few moments ago. You start at the left-hand side of this chart. That's the growth in state expenditures, unadjusted for inflation. 7.1% is the growth rate of FYE staff, or FTE staff, I should say, in the University of Minnesota, largely supported by other than state funding, that is this growth rate. The enrollment has increased about 20% during this period of time, or at least actually most of that has been in the last 5 years. There's been a net price increase for undergraduates in Minnesota of about 34.4%, or about 3.4% a year. And a lot of people argue with me about that, but that's real. That's real. That's a result of really creative work that this board has done to provide financial incentives for students to take more credits and graduate on a timely basis. You'll see also 34.4%. I don't know why these numbers are the same, but they are in degrees granted, and that has a lot to do with improving graduation rate, allowing more capacity at the University of Minnesota. These issues have all been discussed in the Ed Policy Committee. Operating expenditures about 54%, again, mostly from other growth in other sectors. And then the 60.5% increase in grants and contracts during this period of time is something that Vice President Mulcahy has shared with you in great detail. So I think we can take some real pride in the productivity increases you see in this chart, especially in light of the kind of state challenges we've had in the last few years. And anyway, I'm really proud of this record. It's our record. I think we worked hard to achieve it. And that ends my report.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Questions or comments about the President's report? I have just one. I just want to mention, and it came up during the work session that, yes, we've had to make up for some of the shortfalls with tuition, but I also wanted to call attention to while we're talking about the budget, to the ground rule that you set a while back. That after we look at everything else and still have to solve some problems, we have tried to accept 2/3 of it as the responsibility of the university to find through savings, and then look to about 1/3 of it. It's a general guideline that you put out there in front, and I think we followed through pretty well on that. So I thought we ought to just mention that too, as long as that subject had come up. Thank you very much. Item 4, report of the chair. I recognize the new and returning regents in the workshop, but I want to do it in this formal part of the board meeting too. Recognize the election of Regents McMillan, Broad, and Sviggum, and the re-election of Regent Larson. I said before, I'll say it again, it's good to have you with us. We look forward to a long and productive relationship. A number of regents attended the Chancellor Lendley Black's inauguration in Duluth, as the President noted. I just wanted to say thank you for the good representation we had from the board. We had good attendance, and I know from remarks made in Duluth it was very much appreciated. Earlier this week, President-designate Kaler announced that Amy Phoenix will serve as his Chief of Staff. This appointment comes before the board today in the consent business. And I want to note that she has extremely strong credentials. She comes highly recommended. She has earned the confidence of Dr. Kaler, and I think we can all look forward to working with her. Among those credentials is experience here with the University of Minnesota. I also want to note the board's next regular meeting will be May 12th through 13th, 2011 on the Twin City campus. In these times of difficult finances and what have you, we cannot exclude the possibility of some special meeting, but we don't count on it at the moment. So the next regular meeting is May. We traditionally do not meet in April. Item 5, receive and file reports. And without objection or comments, that is so done. Consent business for review and action. It's found on page 30 to 43 and consists of report of the All University Honors Committee, gifts, summaries of expenditures. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second. I got the second from Regent Frobenius. I missed the Regent Johnson. Thank you for the motion. Discussion. All in favor, aye. Aye. Opposed? Carried. Review of the annual Board of Regents calendar found on page 44 and 55. Comments? If not, that is just a review item. Item 8, State of Minnesota Economic Update. Tom Stinson. Oh, he's coming at 11, I understand. Thank you, Ann. So we will keep moving ahead until he is here. Report of the Facilities Committee. Regent Hung.
Thank you, Chair Allen. There was one action item, real estate transactions. The committee unanimously recommended approval of the following real estate transactions: 50-year land lease for hotel at 615 Washington Avenue, Southeast Minneapolis, and a 10-year lease for pediatric faculty offices on UMMC Fairview Riverside campus. I move approval of the transactions.
Is there a second? Seconded, Regent Frobenius. Discussion? If not, all in favor, aye. Aye. Opposed? Carried.
Thank you. Second item, we had a consent report. The committee unanimously recommended approval of the consent report, which contained the following: agreements for the use of university facilities and services for USA Cup Soccer during July 14th through 24th of this year. I move approval of the consent report.
Is there a second? Seconded, Regent Frobenius. Discussion? If not, all in favor, aye. Aye. Opposed? Carried.
Non-action items. We had one real estate transaction. The committee reviewed an agreement with Manchester Grand Hyatt Hotel San Diego for continuing medical education's 2012 World Symposium, February 5th through 12th in 2012. This will return to the committee for action at a future meeting. The committee also reviewed two presentations. The first on the Biomedical Discovery District, which focused on the buildings already constructed and associated research being conducted, and also on the building plan for the cancer cardio facility. The second presentation was on the public safety at the university and dealt with the three areas of emergency management, central security, and the university police department.
Thank you very much. Item 10, report of the Faculty, Staff, Student Affairs Committee. We turn to the pulpit for that. Regent Pastor Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Three action items. First, a collective bargaining agreement with Graphic Communications International Union Local 1B, the Printers Unit 2. The committee unanimously recommends approval of the collective bargaining agreement between the University of Minnesota and Graphic and Communications International Union. I move its approval.
Is there a second? Second. Seconded, Regent McMillan. Discussion, all in favor, aye. Aye. Opposed, carried.
Secondly, the committee unanimously recommends approval of the collective bargaining agreement between the University of Minnesota and the Minnesota State Building and Construction Trades Council on behalf of crafts and trades employees. I move its approval.
Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded, Regent Cohen. Discussion. If not, all in favor, aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, carried.
Thirdly, the committee unanimously recommends approval of the consent report, which includes amendments to the University Senate Constitution and the appointment of Amy Phoenix as Chief of Staff in the Office of the President. I move its approval.
Second.
Seconded, Regent Cohen, and as Regent Johnson noted, this is a revised item in front of you, and he referred to the item on it. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
Thank you. Three non-action items. The committee also discussed and received information on one, proposed revisions to the Board of Regents policy on student education records. Secondly, various approaches being taken by coordinate campuses to ensure student engagement and development. And thirdly, trends and benchmarks related to staff compensation. Mr. Chairman, that ends my report.
Thank you very much, Regent Johnson. Item 11, report of the Finance and Operations Committee, Regent Frobenius.
Thank you, Chair Allen. We have one consent report action. The committee unanimously recommended approval of the revised consent report, which is being passed out to you now for the quick readers in the crowd. That includes purchases of goods and services in excess of $1 million, which is our new guideline we're now using. And secondly, approval of a single new investment manager, I believe it is a $10 million investment within the Consolidated Endowment Fund. Mr. Chair, I move approval of the revised consent report.
Is there a second? Seconded, Regent Simmons. Discussion? If not, all in favor, aye? Aye. Opposed? Carried.
Thank you. Under non-action items, the committee received several presentations. We had a presentation from the Annual Investment Consultants Report, which focused on proposed asset allocation guidelines under consideration, as well as a comparison against other major endowment funds among higher education facilities. We engage Cambridge on an annual basis to do this particular comparison for the Board of Regents. This presentation will be considered along with further discussion and recommendations from the Investment Advisory Committee before a final proposed asset allocation guidelines are brought to this board at a future meeting. We intend to accomplish this yet this fiscal year. The second non-action item was the annual insurance and risk management report, which provided an overview of the university's overall insurance portfolio, with particular attention paid to casualty insurance and workers' compensation. We've had good results. We achieved a significant cost reduction a year ago, and we pretty well maintained that this year. We're pretty close to flat with the previous year's costs of our overall insurance program. University biennial budget update was reviewed in some depth, which identified multiple scenarios for state higher education funding and the university's response to those likely decreases. The committee anticipates further discussion on this subject in May as the budget negotiations continue. We got a few of the items between the lines of the President's summary that he presented in his report. Lastly, we had a thorough discussion of the enterprise financial system, or update of that topic, which provided an update on the continued implementation of the enterprise financial system, which is about 2.5 years now into implementation. There are ongoing challenges with the systems, as well as it does have some strengths, or has a number of strengths. The challenges are particularly related to frustration within the user committee. We reviewed the university's strategy for moving forward with upgrades and systems fixes. And one of the items in the purchase of goods and services over $1 million was an item relating to a number of upgrades to that system. Mr. Chairman, that completes our report.
Thank you very much, Regent Frobenius. Item 12, report of the Audit Committee, Regent Cohen.
The Audit Committee, thank you, Chair Allen. The Audit Committee had 3 non-action items. The first was a review of the fiscal year 2010 audit and non-audit services provided by Deloitte. The second was a discussion and information on the interplay between the university's conflict of interest policy and its outside consulting and other commitments policy. And the third was a robust discussion and presentation about approaches being taken by other higher education institutions and their audit committees to address the current economic environment. That ends my report.
Thank you very much, Regent Cohen. Report of the Educational Planning and Policy Committee, Regent Simmons.
Thank you, Chair Allen. The committee unanimously recommends approval of the consent report, which includes 2 academic program changes. I move approval.
Second. Is there a second? Seconded, Regent Cohen. Discussion? If not, all in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
The committee discussed proposed revisions to the Board of Regents policy on academic freedom and responsibility. Our discussion led to a request for a relook at what's proposed, and we expect that to come back to the committee for action in May, and then we will be bringing that to the full board with our recommendation. We had a report on the university's strategic positioning effort, an update with respect to academic excellence. And importantly, we had an extensive discussion based on a report from Blue Ribbon committees led by Senior Vice Presidents Sullivan and Jones regarding how the university is responding to the economic situation in terms of where we have opportunities to cut back on operating expenses, and at the same time, where it's critically important, we look to investment. The committee responded with a vigorous discussion of ideas we hope are being looked at. We put this in the context of the fact that this isn't the only effort underway to look at how we control our costs, reduce our costs, but yet continue our critical investments. We expect to be hearing more and look forward to that. That ends my report, Chair Allen.
Thank you very much, Regent Simmons. Item 14, report of the Litigation Review Committee, which I chair. I would report that the Litigation Review Committee met yesterday and received a report on a number of attorney-client privileged matters. That concludes my report. I'll ask at the moment if there is any old business. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the consent agenda, I did want to, and I know Dr. Daniels is here, just talk briefly about the resolution to approve the naming rights. I'm reluctant to approve individual requests without really recalling having seen a broader policy about that coming in front of the board. I trust their judgment that this is a good, this is appropriate, but it feels to me like we need a plan and some guidelines before we're lending our name out with our partner, and maybe we've seen that. I'm not clear that we have, and I would respectfully vote no on that to be recorded.
Thank you very much. I'd have to say I have some qualms about that too. We have discussed it before, I think, without really settling on all the criteria that are used in that case. And in view of the fact we have 3 new regents who have not been part of that previous discussion, I think it would be good to bring that item back to us for discussion at some point, and we will see how to do that. Thank you very much for your comments. I do not, all right, Professor Stinson is here. So we will go back to item number 8, and invite Professor Tom Stinson to the table. And there he comes.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Regent Sviggum.
Mr. Chairman, since the wonderful Dr. Tom Stinson was actually my employee for a month, I think I should have. What was that? Anyway, I'm sure you did.
Usually that works both ways.
Notice in that 1 month I did not fire him or get rid of him, nor did I increase his salary, I don't think either. But I think I should take the opportunity to introduce probably the best economist in the state who
I know
certainly
Dr.
everybody
Stinson
has
has
great respect and credibility for.
Dr. Stinson has a very busy schedule, and so while he's attending to the last-minute preparation there, let me just compliment him for the number of times he has come before us and for the insight that he has given to us on the state budget. In recent years, it has not always been a happy thing to look at, but we always do look forward to the intelligence that it brings to the discussion. So we will wait patiently just a moment while they get set up and look forward to his report. Yes, Regent Hung in the meantime.
Thank you, Chair Allen. While we're waiting, I thought I want to ask a question about the report that we got from Trip Umbach earlier today. How do we plan on incorporating some of what we've learned from him into our next marketing efforts towards the legislature?
Chair Allen, Regent Hung, I think we have to incorporate these findings, and I would hope the findings of some additional deeper dives that we're going to do in the next few months into lots of different marketing strategies. Obviously, in our web strategy, using new media, as people talked about. Clearly, we should have talking points for everyone around the table and everyone who speaks on behalf of the university, and have those in really crisp form. There's another effort to really add stories. It's really difficult to look at the numbers without some of the stories. You saw some of the stories yesterday on your tour through the Biomedical Discovery District. So I think one of the ways we need to make this is a more living kind of thing. And the other thing I would say is I think there needs to be a real attempt to align this effort with the overall due diligence you do as a board in examining the changes and the trends in our metrics. I mean, I think this has to be incorporated somewhat into the board's metrics strategy and the other kinds of surveys we do. For example, I think the survey of the general public and how they feel about the university needs to be brought into juxtaposition with these data as we go forward. So I just, and quite honestly, I like the idea of the conversation we had this morning about a really targeted communication strategy. We've met with business journal leaders recently to see if we can get focused discussions. I've met with members of the Itasca Group, Minnesota Business Partnership, to see if we can get much more of this information into the long-term thinking and discussion of strategies for the future of our state. So I think it has to inform our planning. It has to inform the priorities that people are setting. Itasca has recently created a regional economic development entity. And Michael Langley, who comes from the Pittsburgh area, is now joining us, and he'll be the executive director. I think those entities that really sell, companies on coming here to this region, and those entities that work really hard to retain our businesses, like the Chamber and the Minnesota Business Partnership, as well as this economic development entity in this region, all of those need to be kind of connected to this information. This story should be one that sells this state and this community. It shouldn't be just any kind of a self-serving story for the University of Minnesota.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to item 8. Professor Stinson, we welcome you again. We're anxious to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've all heard the numbers. The projected shortfall is now $5 billion, not $6.2 billion, as I told you in November. But the situation really hasn't changed, and it's not materially different from last summer. Then we had a $5.6 billion projected shortfall. Now we have a $5 billion projected shortfall. The story is almost entirely a revenue story. There was a total of $176 million, or 0.3% in expenditure changes, and almost all of those were in human services in 2011. The revenues are expected to be up by $984 million. That's about 2% of total revenues in 11, 12, and 13. So, this is kind of the normal variation that you would expect in a forecast. This slide really just shows you some of the magnitudes and the bottom line. The one thing that is a little different is that in the past, we would have had $663 million of forecast balance would have gone directly into the reserve, because that's the first call on surpluses at the end of a biennium. But at this time, because of requirements under the federal stimulus bill, we cannot use that as part of a reserve, and so that actually just goes through and adds to the beginning balance for 2012, 2013. The question that everybody is curious about is, where did the money come from? And it came really from action by Congress and the President in December when they reached a compromise on the tax bill. That improved the economic outlook, and it also created a special situation that added revenue for the state. Let me talk about the improvement in the economic outlook first. While all the visibility was given to would the Bush tax cuts be extended or not, that was already in almost everybody's forecast. What wasn't in the forecast was a set of stealth stimulus activities that were provided for in there. The most important of those stealth stimulus programs was the reduction in the payroll tax of two percentage points for 2011. That increased discretionary income, spendable income for U.S. Residents by about $111 billion, and it's provided a nice bit of insurance against a slump in 2011. There were two other parts of the bill that also contributed to the economic outlook, improved economic outlook. One was the full year extension of the 99 weeks extended unemployment benefits. Most forecasters didn't have that in their forecast, and then the expensing provisions for capital equipment in 2011. Combined, those three items allowed forecasters to increase their expected growth rates for 2011 by somewhere between 0.7 and 1 percentage point, 0.7 of a percentage point and 1 percentage point. Global Insight, our forecaster, raised their forecast for 2011 from 2.3%, which was really a subpar growth year again, to 3.2%, which is good growth and above average growth in there. There wasn't all good news. The change in the economic outlook really didn't make much change in the employment situation. It's not expected that jobs will get back to their 2007 high before mid-2013, although it looks like it'll be maybe 3 or 4 months sooner. And the unemployment rate is still expected to be in the 7.88% range at the end of 2013. Minnesota's unemployment rate's expected to be a little bit better. It's already a little bit better, but we're still not expecting a huge, rapid recovery. We're expecting Minnesota to move along kind of the same slow path that we've seen. This chart shows you the changes in the forecast from November to February, and what you can see is, if you look at the bars, that there was one really big change, and that's for the first half of 2011. And then after that, the changes are really relatively moderate. So the growth is expected to be front-loaded into 2011, and it's due largely to that payroll tax cut, which added $111 billion. Well, that's part of the story, but there's another part of the story that is possibly a bigger part and certainly a more interesting part. Now, Mr. Chairman, I know that you're a former Commissioner of Revenue, so you know well the intricacies of the tax system and the fact that there was a change in the federal capital gains tax rate that was scheduled to begin in 2011. Part of the tax compromise was that the federal capital gains tax rate, which was scheduled to go to 20%, was delayed for 2 years, and so we had, compared to what was in the forecast, actually a tax cut in the capital gains area at the federal level. We do our forecast based on current law. It's current law in Minnesota, but it's also current federal law. We don't anticipate changes in the tax system at the federal level. And so when we did the forecast, we fully expected that the capital gains rate would go to 20% in 2011. When the capital gains rate was extended, the 15% capital gains rate was extended, that was good news for Minnesota, because that means that there would be more turnover of portfolios, more realizations, more income to tax, and that's something that we hadn't anticipated, but that we got. Capital gains is a relatively small proportion of the Minnesota tax base. It's only about 3%, but in this forecast it accounted for 65% of the change in the revenues. And again, the reason why is that we essentially had a change in the assumption about how fast portfolios would be turning over. That's a nice result for the state to get more money because of a federal tax change, but unfortunately it's a very slender reed to rely on, because capital gains are very volatile. And certainly we could see that money disappear if the stock market slumped, or if people suddenly became less optimistic. Here's a map or a chart that shows you what has happened to capital gains. The maroon bars are federal, U.S. total realizations, not Minnesota, but I can give you a couple of numbers that are Minnesota. The tallest bar for 2007 in Minnesota, that was $10.9 billion of realizations of taxable income. The bar that is 2009, the shortest bar, was $2.5 billion. Those are both actual estimates done from our tax sample. Between 2007 and 2009, we had 2 years of roughly 50% declines in capital gains realizations each year in there. We now, for tax year 2010, have a 73% increase in 10, a 33% increase in 11, and a 20% increase in 12. They look reasonable. It's kind of a reasonable pattern, but there's certainly no guarantees. Capital gains are very volatile, just like the stock market is, and depends upon not just the stock market, but also on investor psychology. Do you let your earnings, your gains ride and hope that you're going to make more next year, or do you sell and try something else? It also depends upon the demand and the activity in business sales and commercial building sales and things like that. It also depends upon the stock of offsetting losses. So I guess what I'm saying is that while this is the best estimate that we could do, we're very conscious of the fact that there are wider confidence intervals around this than we've seen in the past. The next chart shows where the money came from. You can see $500 million came from the income tax, about a 3.2% change in expected individual income tax payments, and again, 65% of that comes from capital gains. $249 million came from the sales tax. Only about 2/3 of that comes actually from higher sales tax collections from individuals purchasing goods. The other third comes from re-estimate of the sales tax refunds that are expected to be paid. Looking on down, the $108 million in other revenues, that's a little deceptive because $58 million of that is money that we were supposed to get from Wisconsin under the reciprocity program in 2011, which we now don't expect to get until 2012. So it's just moving $58 million from 2011 to 2012. All told, we have about 2.7% change in fiscal 12 and 13, 0.6% change in fiscal 2011. Here's another way that we don't usually show you, but another way to look at where the money came from. The additional money, 39% of it came from capital gains, 17% of it came from other income tax, 19% came from the sales tax, 9% from sales tax refunds, and then 16% from a combination of reciprocity, other taxes, and corporate taxes. When I talk to bond rating agencies, when the state's issuing credits or we're updating them for ratings, I always leave a list of uncertainties, things that we're uncertain about, and this time I thought I'd go over just a couple of them with you. It does seem, though, that while in the past, in the past few years when I've talked to you, that all the uncertainty was on the downside, that things could get worse, but I didn't see them getting any better or anything like that. This time there are some possibilities for optimism as well. And in fact, Global Insight, our forecasting service, actually at the time that we did this forecast had a greater weight on its optimistic scenario than it did its pessimistic scenario. And members of our Council of Economic Advisors were almost unanimous in believing that if the forecast was going to be wrong, it would be too pessimistic rather than too optimistic. Now, those things were done before the geopolitical events that are going on right now took place, and so there's certainly risk on geopolitical events. Oil is certainly a concern. You've probably seen these numbers, but they're worth repeating. $10 a barrel increase in the price of oil leads to about a 25-cent per gallon increase in the price of gasoline. And in 1 year, it reduces real GDP growth by 0.2%, costs about 120,000 jobs. In 2 years, if it lasts for 2 years, it takes about 0.5% out of GDP, or 400,000 jobs. And there's an important relationship here. An increase in the price of gasoline of 1 cent per gallon reduces discretionary income by about $1 billion. So going back to what the President and the Congress agreed upon, they provided a $111 billion stimulus package through the payroll tax. That's roughly $1.11, and we've used up more than half of that insurance policy that was put in now. If oil prices and gasoline prices don't stabilize and go down, we could be back in the situation that we were in before the December tax compromise. I don't want to spend too much time depressing you with all the negatives, but let me talk about the one area where there's potential good news, and that's on the employment side. We think that everybody's employment forecast may be a little bit pessimistic. All the pieces are in place for stronger employment growth. And the question really is what sets it off. I mean, corporate profits are high, credit is relatively easy, and we're certainly in a situation where if consumers start spending, there isn't a very much excess capacity of production at this point. Inventories are well under control. So what was hoped was that the payroll tax cut, the emergence of $50 or so a pay period extra in your check would cause people to feel a little better and move on. There's still a good possibility that that will occur. The forecast that we have is more of a middle-of-the-road forecast, but of course I wouldn't be an economist if I didn't tell you that there's also a possible downside that $4 gas or $50 to fill up a tank full of gas may cause people to pull in their horns and stop spending as well. There's certainly possible that we can see capital gains over the next few years higher or lower. The stock market forecast that we used in our capital gains forecast was for 12% growth in there, but you know, we could have faster growth than that, and of course we could also have slower growth than that. On the revenue side, there are reasons and justification to be cautious. There's reasons and justification to be optimistic, and so I guess that you know, one has to be cautiously optimistic looking out at this. On the spending side, there's really not much of a story. Most of the story is human services. Most of the human services story is a technical adjustment relating to FMAP payments received from the federal government and early adoption of Medicaid. This is just really no change in this. This chart is another one of our attempts to explain that the 29% growth from fiscal 2011 to 2010, 2011 to fiscal 2012, 2013 is not an apples to apples comparison. If you leave the federal stimulus money and the K-12 shift savings, which didn't really reduce the level of services provided, just reduced expending in there, and then go from that to the level of 2012, 2013 spending with those in again, you get a 9.6%. This is, again, a much lower growth rate than we've seen in the past. The final slide is one that is sobering, and that is that the real problem still remains out there. Even with an additional $1 billion, we have, if you look at 13, 14, and 15, somewhere a little bit more than $2 billion structural shortfall each year, not counting inflation. Now for 2012, because of the statutory or legislated requirement that we repay the K-12 spending shift, that's a little bit larger, but that's due primarily to the repayment of the K-12 spending shift. So that's the challenge really, is dealing with this longer-term structural deficit that we have, which is roughly $2 billion a year. That's going to be the challenge that the legislature and the governor will face, and the test as to whether they've met that challenge really is going to be what happens to 14 and 15, the estimates for 14 and 15. That concludes my prepared remarks. If you have any questions now, I'd be glad to answer them.
Thank you very much, Professor Stinson. Regents Figum.
Chairman Allen, thank you. Dr. Stinson, one particular question I'll ask you about payment from Wisconsin. Wisconsin owes us like $56 or $57 million in a reciprocity contractual agreement. How are we doing in collecting that?
Not well. Mr. Chairman, Regents, we do not expect to collect that reciprocity payment in this fiscal year, even though it was expected to be paid in December.
that's been now moved into fiscal 2012. It doesn't make any difference to the bottom line number, though, because we still expect it. And so what it's done is to reduce the amount of carry forward from 2011 into 12 and 13.
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Stinson, the check is in the mail, I assume. As you know, when I was there with you for a month, I talked about even going to Wisconsin. I talked about doing a news conference or something to make people aware of this. But I mentioned this to Mr. Chairman only, and it's a very small amount. $56 million is not big in the numbers that he deals with. But the fact is, I mention it because it's just it's showing of what is taking place in the country. And I respect President Brunix when he says that we don't need to compare ourselves to Nebraska, Pennsylvania, Michigan. We don't, what takes place in those states is not, I'm not exactly sure how you said it, President, that is not relative or is not important to us. But when we look at Minnesota and even just our neighboring state, a very, very sister state in Wisconsin, and they can't even pay their contractual agreements. I think we have to be aware of the fact that there is something in this country that is certainly not just unique to Minnesota, and that we are kind of all playing together in the same field. And Minnesota's field is actually better, very honestly.
Just a follow-up to that I'd like to hear from Professor Stinson. I don't know whether the delay in paying is a matter of their budget at the moment or some disagreements or something. I do know when that agreement started, we had trouble collecting. The biggest check I ever had in my pocket was for $27 million when we got it from Wisconsin, involving taxes.
It is the former, not the latter.
Yes.
And as you know, the governors have now ended reciprocity.
Yes, I know. But that was over disagreements, and we finally won the battle and got it paid up. I don't know whether the issue here is ability to pay or some differences in opinion on who owes what.
Mr. Chairman, Regent Swigum, I don't think it's a disagreement over how much is owed.
Okay.
I think that it may have something to do with cash flow looking out across April 15th.
Okay. Regent Simmons, you got your question answered. Regent Broad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Stinson, thank you for being here. I think you and Regent Swigum have something in common in that you're both going to be part of a Trivial Pursuit game at some point. He being the shortest-serving OMB commissioner in state history, and you being the longest-serving economist as well. So I did want you just to repeat a statistic for me that you mentioned. I couldn't get it all written down properly, and I want to make sure I get this one right. Related to the 1 cent increase in gas price and what it does to the GDP.
Okay. Regent Broad, Mr. Chairman, Regent Broad, 1 cent a gallon increase in gas prices reduces the amount of discretionary income that consumers have by about $1 billion. So other things equal, that would mean we would have a reduction in spending of something a little bit less than that, but still a noticeable amount. And what's important here is that one way of thinking about what the Congress and the President did in their December tax compromise was that they bought some insurance against a weaker than expected economy, $111 billion of insurance through the payroll tax cut. And we're using up that insurance at a very rapid rate at this point. And so we could see a reduction in expected growth. Now, Global Insight, our forecaster, their March forecast with the benefit of a lot of what's gone on, we just got yesterday, and they're still saying that they think that the oil price situation is a temporary situation. They think that the geopolitical stress in the Middle East is temporary, and it's not going to change their forecast, their baseline forecast. But they also say that they could be wrong, and that in a couple of months you could see a noticeable change in their forecast.
Other questions? Comments? Regent Larson.
Dr. Stinson, do you know how much of that $19 to $20 million of projected spending over the next, how much of that spending that's projected between almost at 20 in 12 up to a little bit more than that in 15 is entitlements that would require statutory changes in order to reduce it?
Mr. Chairman, Regent Larson, I don't know that. Regent Swiggum might have a better idea than I do, a more precise idea than I do. But in terms of, a strictly defined entitlement, the K-12 spending would not be a strictly defined entitlement. The legislature would have to pass and the governor would have to sign a bill appropriating money for K-12 education. And so there's 40%, 42% of the budget right there. The human services areas where there would be some entitlements, that's 30% of the budget, but I don't think that it's anywhere near 30% that's fixed in there. So my guess is it's relatively small.
Follow up, please.
Go right ahead.
Thank you, Chair. How much longer, if at all, do you think that Minnesota can afford its present welfare system? And the reason I'm asking the question is I've heard that in western Minnesota we've actually got a slight increase in population going on, which is a complete reversal. I said I've heard that, I don't have facts. And the reason for it is because there's very, very little assistance in North and South Dakota, and people are coming across the border to take advantage of our welfare benefits.
Mr. Chairman, Regent Larson, the question is not really one that an economist can answer as to how long we can afford it. We can afford anything that we choose to. The question is how long will we choose to provide the support for it. And that's a decision that people that are elected get to make based on the basis of what their constituents believe. That said, there are some relatively ominous signs. In 2008, there was and this is before the depths of the recession were known. In 2008, there was a study done, the Long-Term Budget Trends Study Commission, and it was looking to forecast for 2033, 25 years out. And the question was, what's going to happen to revenue growth given that we have all the changes in demographics that are going on, and what's going to happen to expenditure demands given that we have all the changes in demographics going on. And the result that I remember is that the good news was that revenues were expected to grow somewhere around 4% annually over that period, which was less than we had in the late 1990s and early 2000s, but still 4% is not bad in there, given that inflation had only been in the twos. What the bad news was that if healthcare expenditures, which include long-term care for the aged, if healthcare expenditures grew by 8.5% per year, which was not a conservative, that's kind of what they were growing at, then there would be money left over for K-12 education, for higher education, for corrections, for welfare system, for all the things that state government does. But it would be the same dollar amount as, or roughly the same dollar amount, not adjusted for inflation, as in 2008. And so that kind of frames the problem that you're referring to, I think. We can afford to do whatever we want to do. The question is, what will we choose to want to do?
Thank you, Dr.
Stinson. Thank you very, very much for your presentation. We've appreciated the in-depth reports you have brought to us and updates like this, which are a little shorter. I also just want to say I commented to Commissioner Showalter last night that I do very much appreciate the reports that are available on the website of the Department of Management and Budget. There's a very thorough understanding available there. Not everyone here may appreciate someone liking to read that, but I knew you would, and I do appreciate it very much. Thank you very much. That concludes our item number 8. I do have one item of new business that I need to bring before the group. We have celebrated the election of new regents and I was going to say retiring regent, but a returning regent, and that is a great time. But it does bring us one item of business that we need to pay attention to. Regent Sviggum turns out to be both an employee of the university and a regent. And there's a good reason for that. He has taught for a number of years at the Humphrey School and has recently taken on a much more significant role there. And his credentials are wonderful for that. I myself have had personal experience when I was teaching of having him as a guest in the classroom. He has a bit of magic with the students, and I know it's exciting for them, and I know how much he enjoys it too. And he has admirable credentials for all of the other work that goes with the Humphrey Institute work he is now assigned. At the same time, we know very well from the various hearings and the vote of the legislature and his record that he has an excellent credentials for being a member of this Board of Regents. And we would value both, except it raises the question of whether or not there is any conflict. If you look carefully, word by word, at our Code of Ethics, it does talk about various possibilities of conflict. And so we need to be upfront about that and examine it carefully. It's not a problem we created, but it is a problem that is in our court right now to solve. Our Code of Ethics says that the chair of the board can decide some of those issues, but the chair can also appoint an ad hoc committee to examine it. It specifies that the ad hoc committee should be made up of the chair, the vice chair, and one member appointed by the chair. And I will speak to that a little more in a moment. I want to point out that by raising this question today, we do not intend whatsoever to say that there is a conflict. We are saying there is a question that needs examination. For an institution of this size and for a board responsible for an institution this size, we must be very transparent in what we do about these issues. We require of all of our workers, and they require of themselves in their own professions, very strong codes of ethics. And in order to be true to that, when a question like this arises, we need to give it the proper attention. For that reason, I am announcing today that I am going to appoint an ad hoc group consisting of myself, Vice Chair Cohen, and Regent Simmons. Regent Simmons is a previous chair of the board, and from other experience, I believe brings a lot of knowledge to that, and we will undertake a discussion of this issue. I think it's important to note that Regent Sviggum has already met 3 times with our corporate counsel and has met with Vice Chair Cohen and myself. So we have already discussed this issue some, and it simply comes to the point where we know that it needs further discussion, it needs broader discussion, and that is why I am appointing this committee. I think it's important, again, to note that we need to have a very diligent review of the facts and a very thoughtful consideration of where we go from here, having understood those facts. We make no judgments today. We simply acknowledge that for one reason or another, we have a question in our court. We have a code of ethics that tells us how to process it, and we will follow that process and to its logical conclusion. Again, I repeat, we make no judgments today except the fact that we have a question and that we need to deal with it. If it is not dealt with now, it will come up later on. It will be a question that is ongoing, and it may come up as issues periodically. So it is much better to deal with it up front, be transparent about it, and take care of it to whatever solution we find from the work of the committee. I also want to compliment Regent Svigum for being upfront about the facts and about where he stands on them. We will work through this, and we will report back to the board. We'll go by the facts, we will go by thoughtful consideration, and we will come up with a resolution. Under our other codes, and I will plan to be a spokesperson for this. It's a delicate issue, and I would ask all involved to abide by our rules that we try to have one voice speaking for the group. I know that's difficult at times, but it's probably all the more important in a case like this. So that is my new item. I would be open to comments or questions about that, but I think I have tried to say all that should be said today. Regent Cohen.
Thank you, Chair Allen. I just want to add, and thank you for presenting the issue, that in our Code of Ethics and Conflict of Interest policies, that it does say that the deliberations of the ad hoc committee will come to the full board. So I think it's important that board members recognize that they also will be part of this process.
And I want to just add something that I did allude to before. You know, I think the Humphrey School made a wonderful choice. As I said, Regent Svigum's credentials were wonderful. They were exactly what he needed for the position they were looking for. It was a wonderful choice. And the legislature and the Regent Candidate Advisory Council screened candidates. They found a good candidate for this Board of Regents. It's a choice that was based on credentials. And that is wonderful. The question is, are the two things totally compatible, or at least compatible within some realms that can be handled by the normal recusal process? And that is the question we deal with today. So, thank you very, very much.
Chairman, maybe
Regent Svigum.
maybe with the lights on me a little hotter right now than they were a couple minutes ago, I ought to make at least a couple of comments in response. And
please do.
To my fellow regents, I apologize for putting you in this uncomfortable position. I assume it's not comfortable for you. I assume that. I will tell you up front, I don't think that there is any conflict from my own personal bones, my own personal feeling. I think that any ethics question, I mean, I've gone through the legislature and been vetted by opponents for 34 years and never had a question of any ethics question even surface regarding my public service. Having said that, I think it's important that it do be addressed, and it be addressed up front, and it be addressed in a positive way, so that everybody's aware of what is taking place and why. I have had, as Regent Allen said, I think 3 meetings with himself, with Vice President Cohen twice, I believe, and with Council. It's a delicate issue, I understand that. To you, my fellow regents, again, let me apologize for putting you in an uncomfortable position, because I can just assume when, I assume that Regent Allen has spoken to some of you about this. If he hasn't, he isn't doing his job. And I assume that he has, and I assume that that causes uncomfortability, and it certainly causes difficulty for a cohesive board. It certainly causes difficulty for personality trust when regents talk about each other with a group of 2 or 3. I respect that, I understand that, I've been there. I want you to know that up front, everything has been open and transparent about my relationship with the university and the Humphrey School. I need you to know that. I need you to know that President Brunix knows that I taught at the Humphrey School and teach there. I need you to know that when I was recruited to run as regent, and yes, recruited was the right word, I asked the person from the RCAC board if it would be a conflict with my relationship with the Humphrey, and the response was no. When I signed a contract with the Humphrey, I asked the Dean Lindsay if there was a conflict. He said, absolutely not. No problems, questions there whatsoever. Legislators who voted on regent positions are well aware of my relationship with the Humphrey School because I have about 15 students over there right now in practicums dealing with legislators, and some of my ex-students actually work over there, have gotten jobs. I mean, that's kind of what we're about here a little bit, is to make sure that people have jobs and employment afterwards. I personally in my heart feel that there is no problem, there's no ethical problem, there's no conflict. If there is a sin, and I want you to understand this perspective, if there is a sin, the sin is I'm raising money for the University of Minnesota. The sin is I'm teaching students at the University of Minnesota and educating them, and they love the class, and they love the involvement in the classes, both ex and current students. If there is a sin, it will be bringing legislators and executive branch members to an open forum next month, which I'm sponsoring at the Humphrey School, to talk about where they're going to go with the budget before they actually go there behind closed doors, to do it in open, in public, so people understand what's going on, what the decisions are. Those are not great sins to me. In fact, I think those are welcome sins, if there is a sin. I don't believe there is. And bottom line is, I'll just tell you that I'm very, very proud of the Humphrey School. I'm very proud of the staff there. I'm very proud of the students. The students are absolutely wonderful. And I'm proud of my relationship with the Humphrey School. I don't think there's a sin. And I certainly have the ability, both professionally and personally, to rise above any conflict that the Humphrey School would give me in serving the best interests of the University of Minnesota. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I do not want to get into the debate and discussion that ought to take place in the committee that we have just appointed. I understand Regent Svigum's points that he has made. I disagree with some of it, and will do so in the committee. I just want to be on record. I don't want to debate those issues right now. I do want to say one thing that I hope I can follow and be true to my own belief, and I hope Regent Svigum can too. I heard a quote many years ago that friendship should never interfere with debate of the issues, and debate of the issues should not interfere with the friendship. We have been friends a long time, and we will debate the issues carefully and vehemently on this issue. With that, no other business coming before the group. We are adjourned.